The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air for what felt like an eternity. Eleanor Wilson's hand remained raised, steady despite the storm of doubt raging within her. Around her, the sparse crowd in Millbrook's town hall whispered among themselves. A divorced woman of 52, bidding on the abandoned Sullivan mansion was unexpected entertainment in their small town of 6,500 souls. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his voice bouncing off the century-old beams overhead. "Going twice." Eleanor felt a bead of perspiration trace a path down her temple. The manila envelope containing her life savings, $15,000 accumulated through years of frugal living, pressed against her side in her worn leather handbag. The arthritis in her fingers flared as she kept her hand aloft. A physical reminder of why she was making this seemingly reckless decision. "Sold! To Mrs. Wilson for $11,800. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to split Eleanor's life in two. Before and after. 25 years of marriage ended by divorce papers 6 months ago. 20 years of accounting work ended by her doctor's solemn warning about stress exacerbating her rheumatoid arthritis. And now, the beginning of something entirely new. Owner of the infamous Ravenwood estate that had stood empty on the hill overlooking Millbrook since Harold Sullivan's death in 2005. "The city will be glad to have it off their books," muttered Henry Patterson, owner of the local hardware store, as he passed her chair. "But you've got your work cut out for you, Eleanor. That place hasn't been fit for habitation in years." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She had just purchased a dilapidated mansion with a leaking roof, broken windows, and God knows what other problems, using nearly all her savings. The remaining money would barely cover initial repairs, let alone the complete renovation the house needed. Have you ever made a life-changing decision that others thought was pure madness? What gave you the courage to follow your heart instead of conventional wisdom? Share your story in the comments below. Rain poured from a gunmetal sky as Eleanor's Honda Civic struggled up the overgrown driveway of Ravenwood later that afternoon. Beside her, Olivia, her 17-year-old daughter, stared through the rain-streaked windshield with an expression of utter disbelief. In the back seat, Cooper, their aging golden retriever, pressed his nose against the window, tail thumping tentatively against the worn upholstery. The mansion loomed before them, a strange architectural amalgamation of Victorian grandeur and mid-century stubbornness. Stone walls rose 3 stories high, topped by peaked roofs with elaborate cornices. Once elegant windows, many now cracked or completely shattered, stared back at them like disappointed eyes. The grounds, once meticulously landscaped according to town legend, had surrendered to wilderness, oak trees and wild roses competing for dominance, their battle obscuring the original design. "Mom," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "What have you done?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with all the tension that had simmered since Richard had walked out on Christmas Eve. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar ache in her joints a counterpoint to the pain in her heart. "I've given us a chance at a new beginning," she said finally, trying to infuse her voice with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "By buying a haunted house?" Olivia's voice cracked with adolescent incredulity. "This place is a disaster. Everyone at school talks about how crazy old Mr. Sullivan died alone in there, surrounded by newspapers from the 1950s and talking to ghosts." "Harold Sullivan was misunderstood," Eleanor corrected gently. "And this house just needs someone who can see its potential." Cooper's sudden bark interrupted their conversation as he scratched at the car door, eager to explore his new territory despite the rain. Eleanor smiled at her daughter, reaching across the console to squeeze her hand. "Let's at least look inside before you decide your mother has completely lost her mind." The first night in Ravenwood was an adventure neither woman would soon forget. With no electricity yet connected, they made camp in what had once been the library, the only room with intact windows and a fireplace that still functioned. Eleanor had spent the afternoon clearing away decades of dust and cobwebs, revealing oak bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, still filled with leather-bound volumes that had somehow survived the years of neglect. They spread air mattresses on the floor, surrounded themselves with battery-powered lanterns, and ate sandwiches from the cooler they'd brought. Cooper seemed strangely at home in the old house, exploring every corner with his nose to the ground, tail wagging gently. He stopped, however, at a large portrait hanging above the mantelpiece, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow viewers across the room. "Harold Sullivan, I presume?" Eleanor said, studying the painting. Cooper sat before it, head tilted to one side, and let out a soft whine. "Great," Olivia muttered. "Even the dog thinks this place is weird." But as the night deepened and the rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof, something shifted between mother and daughter. Perhaps it was the shared adventure or the sheer vulnerability of their situation. But when Eleanor began pointing out constellations through gaps in the curtains, Olivia's cynical facade cracked just enough to reveal glimpses of the wide-eyed child she'd once been. "When I was little," she said quietly, "Dad promised to build me a telescope. He never did." Eleanor reached across the small space between their mattresses and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Maybe we could build one together." The moment of connection was brief but precious, like finding an intact piece of antique china among the rubble. Eleanor held it carefully in her heart as she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rain and Cooper's gentle snoring at her feet. Morning brought sunshine and the first of many challenges. Richard's sleek BMW pulled up the driveway just as Eleanor was assessing the roof damage from the front yard. Her ex-husband stepped out, his Italian leather shoes immediately gathering mud from the unpaved drive. "Eleanor," he called, his voice carrying that particular blend of concern and condescension she'd grown to dread during their final years together. "We need to talk." Standing in the overgrown yard, Eleanor felt a familiar twinge in her joints that had nothing to do with her arthritis. Richard looked exactly as he always had, tall, distinguished, confident in his tailored suit, while she stood before him in work clothes, her auburn gray hair pulled back messily, painfully aware of every line on her face, every extra pound on her frame since he'd left her for his 29-year-old secretary. "This is madness," he said without preamble, gesturing at the house. "You can't seriously expect to live here, and you certainly can't expect Olivia to. I've spoken with my lawyer about revisiting our custody arrangement." The threat hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Eleanor felt her newfound confidence wavering until Cooper appeared beside her, pressing against her leg as if lending her his strength. "Olivia is 17, Richard," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "In less than a year, she'll make her own decisions about where to live, and this is my home now." "A broken-down fire trap is not a home," Richard snapped. "You need to think about—" "Dad?" Olivia appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I'm staying with Mom. At least she's trying something new instead of replacing her wife with a newer model." Richard's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Cooper began barking insistently, drawing their attention to a woman walking purposefully up the driveway. She was elegant, steel-haired, with an expression that could curdle milk. "Mrs. Wilson?" she called. "I'm Victoria Sullivan, Harold's niece. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Later that evening, while sorting through a cabinet in what had once been Harold's study, Eleanor made her first significant discovery. Hidden behind outdated tax forms was a thick medical file, Harold Sullivan's psychiatric records. Diagnosed with schizophrenia in his later years, he had become obsessed with protecting what he called the stolen legacy and had filled notebooks with references to a treasure that needed safeguarding. Eleanor traced her fingers over his handwritten notes, feeling a strange kinship with this man who had been dismissed by the town as crazy. She too knew what it was like to have others question your decisions, your very sanity. "What are you reading?" Olivia asked from the doorway. Eleanor hesitated, then held out the file. "I think there's more to Harold Sullivan's story than people realize." As winter yielded reluctantly to spring, Ravenwood began a slow transformation. Eleanor took a part-time job at the local library, learned basic home repair from YouTube videos and evening classes at the hardware store, and made unexpected allies in the small town. Martha, who ran the local cafe, offered Olivia a weekend job and introduced Eleanor to a circle of women who met monthly for wine and conversation. Many were divorced, widowed, or facing empty nests. Women reinventing themselves in middle age who understood Eleanor's journey better than she'd expected. Walter Jenkins, the former mayor now in his mid-80s, became a regular visitor, sitting on the newly repaired porch swing and sharing stories of Millbrook's history, including his memories of Harold Sullivan. Harold wasn't always a recluse, Walter explained one warm afternoon, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of Eleanor's homemade lemonade. He was brilliant, actually, made his fortune in mining and investments. But after that legal battle with his brother's family in the 40s, something changed in him. He became obsessed with protecting what he called his family's honor. Eleanor leaned forward, her gardening gloves forgotten in her lap. "What legal battle?" "Over inheritance, I believe. His brother died in an accident, and the widow claimed Harold had taken more than his fair share of the family business. Nasty stuff. Courts eventually ruled in Harold's favor, but by then, the damage was done. He withdrew from society, built this place, and rarely left it until his death." Cooper, who had been dozing at Eleanor's feet, suddenly raised his head and stared intently at the house. A moment later, he bolted inside, barking urgently. "That dog of yours," Walter chuckled, "acts like he's having conversations with Harold's ghost." Do you believe houses can be haunted? Or do all old homes simply hold the stories and secrets of those who lived there before? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Inside, Eleanor found Cooper pawing at the basement door, whining insistently. The basement had been on her renovation list, but the musty, partially flooded space had remained largely unexplored due to more pressing repairs above ground. "Not today, boy," she murmured, leading him away. "We'll check it out when Olivia gets home." But Cooper's strange behavior continued in the following weeks. He would sit for hours staring at Harold's portrait, head tilted as if listening to an inaudible voice. He pawed at the basement door every evening at precisely 7:15. And sometimes in the dead of night, Eleanor would wake to find him standing vigil at her bedroom window, watching something in the darkness that only he could see. Spring brought new challenges. Eleanor's arthritis flared painfully, making even simple repairs difficult. On particularly bad days, she would find herself sitting on the floor after dropping a tool, tears of frustration mingling with tears of pain, wondering if Richard had been right about her foolish dreams. During one such moment, she was startled by a gentle touch on her shoulder. Olivia, who had come home early from school to find her mother crying silently in the hallway. "Let me help," Olivia said simply, helping Eleanor to her feet. That evening, they sat together looking through a photo album Eleanor had found in the attic, pictures of Ravenwood in its prime, when Harold had hosted the occasional charity event or family gathering. "It was beautiful once," Olivia admitted, tracing a finger over a photograph of the gardens in full bloom. "I can see why you fell in love with it." The next day, Richard's lawyer delivered formal paperwork requesting a custody review. The following week, a city inspector arrived with a list of code violations that would cost thousands to remedy. And Victoria Sullivan began a campaign of legal letters and thinly veiled threats, claiming that Eleanor had no right to alter any aspect of the property as it constituted tampering with potential evidence in an ongoing family dispute. The tension took its toll on Olivia, who swung between fierce loyalty to her mother and adolescent frustration at their circumstances. "Everyone at school thinks we're crazy living in this place," she snapped one evening after a particularly difficult day. "Zach is the only one who doesn't make fun of me." Zach, Martha's son, had become Olivia's closest friend and frequent visitor to Ravenwood. Eleanor was grateful for his presence. The quiet, thoughtful boy seemed to bring out the best in her daughter. "Maybe they're right," Olivia continued, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe this was all a huge mistake. Maybe I should just go live with Dad until college." The words stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. Before she could respond, however, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, and rain began pouring down in sheets. Within minutes, water was seeping into the basement at an alarming rate. "So much for movie night," Eleanor sighed, reaching for her raincoat. "We need to check the basement before it floods completely." Working together in the dim light of emergency lanterns, mother and daughter created a makeshift dam of old towels and began the tedious process of bailing water. Cooper paced anxiously, whining and barking at a section of wall partially hidden behind an old wine rack. "What's gotten into him?" Olivia asked, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow. "I don't know. He's been obsessed with the basement for weeks." As the water level lowered, Cooper's pawing grew more frantic. In the beam of her flashlight, Eleanor noticed something unusual: a section of brick that seemed newer than the surrounding wall. "Olivia," she called, "bring the light closer." The bricks were indeed different, slightly smaller, differently colored, and the mortar fresher than the surrounding wall. Cooper barked once, sharply, and then began digging at the accumulated mud at the base of the wall. His paw struck something metallic. Eleanor knelt beside him, ignoring the protest from her joints, and brushed away the mud. A small metal box emerged, a safe, old but in good condition with a simple key lock. "Is that?" Olivia whispered, crouching beside her mother. "I don't know." Eleanor turned the safe in her hands. "But I think I might know where to find the key." In Harold's study, behind the portrait that had so fascinated Cooper, they found a small wall safe. Using the combination from a sequence of numbers they'd discovered in Harold's medical records, his patient ID repeated obsessively in his notes, they opened it to find a single key and a leather-bound journal. The key fit the basement safe perfectly. Inside was a map of the basement with a large X marked behind the wine rack, along with a smaller key taped to a yellowed index card bearing a single word: legacy. Eleanor and Olivia exchanged a glance, their earlier argument forgotten in the thrill of discovery. "Should we?" Olivia gestured toward the basement. Eleanor nodded, her heart racing. "Together." The wall behind the wine rack, when examined closely, revealed a hairline crack outlining a door. The small key fit a nearly invisible keyhole, and with a grinding of long unused hinges, the door swung open to reveal a hidden chamber. Cooper pushed past them, tail wagging furiously as if greeting an old friend. The beam of their flashlight revealed dozens of wooden crates, carefully preserved under oilcloth coverings. Eleanor approached the nearest one with trembling hands and gently lifted the cover. Gold, gleaming bars of gold, neatly stacked and marked with dates from the 1930s. The next crate contained coins, gold sovereigns, silver dollars, and other currency. Another held jewelry and gemstones. "Mom," Olivia whispered, her voice shaking. "What is all this?" Before Eleanor could answer, Cooper barked once and nudged a leather portfolio that had fallen between two crates. Inside were documents, deeds, receipts, court filings, and personal letters dating back to the 1940s. As they read through the papers by lantern light, Harold Sullivan's true story emerged. The stolen legacy wasn't stolen at all. Harold had legally purchased the family assets, including a substantial gold reserve, from his brother's widow after a lengthy court battle. The documents proved he had paid fair market value, contrary to the family's claims of theft. Harold had hidden the treasure not out of greed or paranoia, but to protect it from relatives he believed would squander it. His journal revealed his hope that someday, someone worthy would find his legacy and use it for good. "There must be millions here," Olivia said, awe in her voice. "Maybe hundreds of millions." Eleanor carefully replaced the papers, her mind racing. This discovery would change everything, for her, for Olivia, for the town. But with great fortune came great responsibility and greater complications. "We need to do this right," she said finally. "Legally and ethically. First thing tomorrow, we contact a lawyer. Then we report this to the proper authorities." As they climbed the stairs, leaving the treasure secured behind them, Eleanor felt Cooper press against her leg. For a moment, she could almost imagine that Harold Sullivan himself was there, nodding in approval at her decision. The following weeks were a whirlwind of lawyers, government officials, appraisers, and security personnel. News of the discovery spread rapidly, transforming Ravenwood from local curiosity to national sensation. Reporters camped at the end of the driveway, and curious tourists drove slowly past, hoping for a glimpse of the treasure house of Millbrook. Through it all, Eleanor maintained a quiet dignity, refusing interviews and focusing on the legal process of documenting and authenticating the find. The preliminary appraisal was staggering. Over $350 million in gold, jewelry, coins, and collectibles. Victoria Sullivan arrived with a team of lawyers, claiming the treasure belonged to the Sullivan Family Trust. But Eleanor had a surprise ally in Walter Jenkins, who provided court records showing that Harold had legally dissolved the family trust in 1952, making all assets his personal property. The court proceedings were lengthy and complex, but when Eleanor presented the documents found with the treasure, proving Harold's legal ownership and detailing his hope that the finder would use the wealth wisely, the judge ruled in her favor. Eleanor was awarded 70% ownership, with 20% going to the state for taxes and 10% allocated to a historical preservation fund. Richard withdrew his custody petition without explanation, though Eleanor suspected Martha might have had something to do with his change of heart. She'd seen them in deep conversation at the cafe more than once. The most unexpected resolution came from Victoria Sullivan herself. After the court ruling, she requested a private meeting with Eleanor at Ravenwood. Expecting recriminations, Eleanor was surprised when Victoria arrived alone, without lawyers, looking smaller and older than she had in the courtroom. "My son has leukemia," Victoria said without preamble, sitting stiffly in the newly refurbished parlor. "The treatments are experimental and expensive. That's why I push so hard for the claim, not that it excuses my behavior." Eleanor studied the proud woman across from her, noting the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "I'm so sorry about your son. How old is he?" 12. His name is James." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "The prognosis is good, but the medical bills—" Eleanor thought of Olivia, of the terror any mother would feel facing such a situation. She thought of Harold Sullivan, alone in his mansion with his treasure, hoping it would someday do good. "I'd like to help," Eleanor said simply. "Not as a settlement or out of guilt, but because it's the right thing to do." Victoria's eyes widened. "Why would you do that? After how I've treated you?" Eleanor glanced at Cooper, dozing peacefully in a patch of sunlight. "Let's just say a mutual friend suggested it might be what Harold would have wanted. If you were in Eleanor's position, would you have helped Victoria after everything she'd done? Is generosity toward those who've wronged us truly healing, or simply naive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 1 year after the discovery, Ravenwood stood transformed. The stone mansion gleamed in the summer sunlight, its gardens restored to a careful blend of Harold's original design and Eleanor's own vision. Inside, the restoration had preserved the home's character while creating a warm, welcoming space that felt like home. Eleanor had allocated the treasure thoughtfully. Beyond ensuring financial security for herself and Olivia, she established the Sullivan Wilson Foundation to support single parents, arthritis research, and senior citizens in the community. The East Wing of Ravenwood became a community center, where Eleanor hosted monthly gatherings for women navigating major life transitions. "When I first moved into this house," she told the group gathered in what had once been the formal ballroom, "I thought I was simply buying a roof over our heads. I never imagined I was also purchasing a chance at a new life, not just for myself, but for so many others." Olivia, preparing for college where she planned to study historical preservation, had blossomed into a confident young woman. Her friendship with Zach had deepened into something more, but both were sensible enough to recognize that their futures might take different paths. "You know what's funny?" she said to Eleanor one evening as they worked together in the garden. "I used to think you were crazy for buying this place. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." Victoria Sullivan, to everyone's surprise, became a valued ally. Her expertise in art and antiques proved invaluable in cataloging Harold's collections, and a portion of the foundation's resources ensured her son received the best possible care. In an unexpected twist of fate, James's doctor turned out to be Richard's new brother-in-law, creating an odd connection between all their lives. "Life has a strange way of bringing things full circle," Victoria remarked during a foundation meeting. "Harold would be pleased, I think, to see how his legacy has brought healing instead of division." Eleanor herself had found a new purpose, and, to her surprise, a new relationship. Walter Jenkins' grandson, a widower in his late 50s who had returned to Millbrook to care for his grandfather, shared Eleanor's love of literature and gardening. Their friendship had grown slowly, naturally, without the pressure or expectations that had marked her marriage. "I never expected to find love again at 53, Eleanor confided to Martha during one of their coffee mornings. "But then again, I never expected any of this." Martha squeezed her hand. "Sometimes the best chapters of our lives are the ones we never plan to write." On the anniversary of the treasure's discovery, Eleanor sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the garden in gold. Cooper lay at her feet, gray-muzzled now, but content. Olivia emerged from the house with lemonade, followed by Zach and Victoria. "Penny for your thoughts, Mom," Olivia said, handing Eleanor a glass. Eleanor smiled, taking in the scene before her. The house she had brought back to life, the people who had become her chosen family, the future stretching before them all. "I was thinking about treasures," she said softly. "Not the gold we found in the basement, but the treasures we discover when life forces us to start again." Cooper raised his head suddenly, looking toward Harold's portrait visible through the window. For a moment, in the golden light of sunset, Eleanor could almost imagine a figure standing there, a tall man with intense eyes, nodding in approval. "The real treasure," Eleanor continued, reaching down to stroke Cooper's head, "isn't what we find. It's what we build from the broken pieces. It's discovering strength we never knew we had." As twilight deepened into night, the lights of Ravenwood glowed warm and welcoming against the darkening sky. A beacon on the hill, a home rebuilt, a legacy reborn. In the end, Eleanor reflected, we all leave something behind. Harold Sullivan had left his treasure, yes, but also his hope that it would find its way to someone who would use it wisely. Eleanor hoped that her own legacy would be equally meaningful, not measured in gold, but in lives touched, relationships healed, and the courage to begin again, no matter how daunting the ruined mansion before you might appear. Sometimes, after all, the most beautiful homes are built from the ashes of what came before. And sometimes, The most valuable treasures aren't found in hidden chambers beneath the earth, but in the human heart's remarkable capacity for renewal, forgiveness, and love. Even at 52, Eleanor had discovered it's never too late to excavate the gold buried within yourself, the resilience, wisdom, and strength that no amount of money could ever buy. As Cooper settled more deeply against her feet and the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. The broken woman who had raised a trembling hand at an auction a year ago had been rebuilt, just like Ravenwood itself, into something stronger and more beautiful than before. "To new beginnings," she whispered to the night, raising her lemonade glass in a silent toast to Harold Sullivan, to her daughter, to the future, and most importantly, to herself.